It's Sandro here, and I'm back in Melbourne this week. And with me today is Dr Fiona Lander. Fiona's a very interesting character, but also an incredible emerging leader in global health. Combines a background in two distinct areas, which she'll talk about in a moment, and has found a very interesting path to combining medicine or global health more generally with another profession that is equally demanding but also rewarding. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us, Fiona.
My pleasure.
So Fiona, can you tell us a little bit, because you've got a very interesting, you're still in the first sort of at least third of your career, I would hope, the first 10 years. And you've already done some very interesting things. You've done two, as I said, quite distinct degrees in different fields, but with an overlap that's often forgotten. You've then done a very interesting sort of practical experience, which I'd love to hear more about. And now you're kind of straddling both communities and continuing to practice. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey in global health and what on earth I'm talking about?
Fair enough. Yes, well, it's true. I do work in two very different disciplines, as Sandro has alluded to. I studied both medicine and law as an undergraduate student at Monash University. In Australia, it is actually possible to do both degrees as an undergraduate, although it's very unusual. Most people choose not to, of course. And yeah, I mean, I've really found that my passion in global health lies in the field of law and regulation, and I think that it's going to become an area that's increasingly important over the coming decades, given the emergence of non-communicable diseases with all of their risk factors that are amenable to behavioural modification.
Yeah.
I studied medicine initially, and in the first year I felt that it would be, frankly, ludicrous to do medicine and law together, given how demanding the course would be. I remember having the same thought. Yes. But at the end of first year, you know, I felt like I was ready for another challenge. And for me, the thing that really sparked my interest was Monash University's medico-legal tutorials that were run in my first year of medicine.
So these are tutes run for medical students, basically how to keep out of trouble with the law, sort of around ethics and law and the legal aspects of medicine.
That's certainly one way of putting it.
Sure.
I mean, I think that it's really important for doctors these days to have a really good understanding, or at least a very basic understanding of the law, particularly around concepts like consent and confidentiality. The reality is, particularly in the Western world, we live in increasingly litigious societies, and you know, it's really important to be aware of the law, because at the end of the day, the law reflects societal expectations around doctors' behaviours. So I took up law as well on the basis of that, and I found that I liked both of them so much that I finished both degrees after 7 years. I fully expected that over time I would prefer one over the other, but at the end of my 7 years I found I was genuinely equally passionate about both of them, which I think is unusual, but I think also leaves me in a unique position to contribute to domestic and global health.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a clinician, you've got a great understanding, as a doctor or someone working in the healthcare system, you've got a great understanding of the law and those concepts, those legal concepts that you talked about. But also you've managed to now apply, and you know, it's funny because when I go around the world, I love talking about people I admire, and one of those people is you. And sometimes I get into a conversation and I'll bring up the fact that you've done both courses and the fact that you practice in both areas, and people's faces sort of light up. It's like, oh, we need more people like this in global health, people who understand the legal aspects as well as the biomedical aspects of public and global health. So what do you think is the relevance of a law degree for someone in global health with or without a medical degree?
Well, I think that lawyers are really well placed to deal with these emerging problems that I was referring to before. I mean, we've had lawyers on hand who for years have dealt with the nitty-gritty aspects of things like the international health regulations that have been around for decades and were only recently revised. And as well as that, more recently we can see the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which essentially is a legal instrument that many countries in the world have signed on to, that is designed to improve the health of people all around the globe. These are fantastic initiatives. And I think that as non-communicable diseases particularly become a problem in the developing world as well as the developed world, there will need to be better legal responses to these issues. You look at a country like Australia where the sale and promotion of tobacco is heavily regulated. Australia is a world leader in this area, and you look at our plain packaging legislation, that is absolutely novel. There are a number of countries that are learning from the example that we're setting, and we're in fact collaborating with a number of developing countries, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, to help them develop laws and mechanisms of law enforcement to ensure that the risks around non-communicable diseases are minimised. So tobacco use, sedentary lifestyle, poor diet, all of these things are amenable to legal regulation. And I really feel there's a massive role for lawyers to play in this area, whether or not they have a formal background in medicine.
Very often, when you talk to people in the health sector, and particularly when you talk to people outside of the health sector, regulation is almost a dirty word. That it's seen, and I find this particularly in some of the communities I work with, that regulation is sort of seen as the last resort. But you obviously don't agree. You feel that there's immense opportunity in regulation towards a healthier population. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've obviously that's been informed by your medical knowledge as well as your legal knowledge now. So what's sort of your take on the role of regulation in global health?
Look, as a lawyer, I have always felt that regulation needs to be balanced with individual freedom. That has always been the case. However, I feel that in developed nations, there is perhaps a little bit of complacency around regulation. As someone who lived in the developing world for 2 years, as I worked in Mumbai in India for 2 years, I experienced there the consequences of a lack of regulation. On a weekly basis, I became ill because of the incredibly poor quality of the water in Mumbai. And, gradually over time I developed resistance. And by the end of the 2 years, I had, an immune system that was probably equal to most of the locals in terms of combating the kind of waterborne bacteria and amoeba that, you encounter on a daily basis just through eating and drinking there. And then, I came back to Australia and I read all of these articles about the explosion of the nanny state and how all of these regulations are stifling Australians' daily lives. And I don't doubt that there are some areas that are over-regulated. I don't doubt that red tape sometimes prevents people from doing what they want or businesses from growing. But at its heart, I feel that health regulation is always enacted with a good purpose. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why we have such a great quality of life in Australia. And I suppose the mark of a very good regulation is that you don't even really realise that it's functioning. It just becomes part of your everyday existence. And I think that most of our health regulations and our surveillance and enforcement are so unnoticeable now. They've become such a part of the fabric of our everyday life that people do take them for granted. So yes, look, I do believe in regulation within reason. I think that it has a vital role to play in lifting developing countries out of these situations where people are constantly getting ill in situations that are totally preventable.
Yeah, a great sort of summary of the importance of judicious regulation. In terms of, you touched on for a moment there, because as I said, we've been friends for quite a few years, and I remember your journey to Mumbai, leaving and being there and coming back. It was a really interesting experience and also a fascinating position and role that you had. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, for 2 years I worked with the UN Special Rapporteur on Health, Anand Grover. UN rapporteurs are independent experts that are appointed by the member states of the United Nations to report back on particular issues or on particular countries. So there are a number of different issue mandates such as health, education, arbitrary detention, things like that. And so Anand, who I worked for 2 years, was effectively the top independent expert in the world on the right to health as it is defined in the various UN treaties. Now, as part of the role that I had with him for 2 years, we investigated how the right to health was fulfilled in many different countries. So I was lucky enough to participate in country missions in Australia, Ghana, Guatemala and Syria. In fact, 2 months before the revolution in Syria. And as well as that, we ran consultations for civil society organisations in a number of regions, including Russia, Eastern Europe, East Africa, and a number of others. I mean, these were extraordinary experiences. Living in India as well was an extraordinary experience. And for me, it was a really good opportunity to combine my two specialties.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. It's sort of, you were able to combine, because you were fresh out of medical school and law school.
That's right.
And yet to practice in both, or either. And you had this incredible opportunity, but also, I mean, I know you, so you're also extremely bright and would have brought such kind of intelligence and gusto to the role, but you had this opportunity to kind of combine both of these in one practical application. That must have been incredible.
Oh, look, it was such an extraordinary opportunity, and I know I reuse the word extraordinary, but it really was. And it was such an interesting way that it came about. I mean, I know there's so many people interested in working in global health, and some of these things just happened by chance. I went to a meeting at WHO.
Most of these things, probably.
Well, yeah, I think that's quite true. There's often not, an advertised position description for these jobs.
Sorry, you were saying you went to WHO.
Yes, I was doing an internship there, and I happened
in Geneva.
In Geneva, that's right, in the Health and Human Rights team, and I happened to meet Anand while I was there, and he offered me a job on the day, which I wasn't expecting at all. And it was a difficult decision in some ways because I was concerned about deferring my medical internship. I was worried about being out of clinical practice for a while, and then after speaking to a number of my mentors, because I'm very lucky to have really supportive senior role models who give me terrific advice, and they all said, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Absolutely. So I went for 1 year and stayed for 2, and I haven't regretted that for a second. I really feel that the experience I gained there was always once in a lifetime type of experience. And
do you think that it makes you a stronger doctor or lawyer or both?
Oh, absolutely.
Stronger person?
Yes. Well, the experience of living in India for 2 years has absolutely made me a stronger person.
In what way? Tell us a bit about that.
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it wasn't until I lived in India that I properly appreciated for the first time what it was like to be part of a minority group. And I can't even begin to explain to you how powerful that was for me. I never expected how awful it would feel to experience racism and sexism on an everyday basis. And this should not be taken as a slight on India. I love India as a country, and I mean, I've returned there since, and I will continue to go back. But there is no doubt in my mind that there are things that need to change there. And I think I can say that in an informed way, having lived there for 2 years. The reality was I couldn't file a tax return without putting my father's name on it. Because for Indian legal purposes, he was the head of my household. Yeah, right. Even though he wasn't in the country.
And how do those experiences then change who you are as a person, but also as a clinician, and even how you approach global health, to bring it back to global health?
Well, I think the combination of living in India and also travelling to a number of countries where minority groups are treated appallingly, and I won't name them for politeness' sake, but frankly, I saw some things that I didn't expect to see. And that might sound naive, but you hear about how people are treated in countries that are supposedly developed. And then you go there and you realise that there's people that can't even access basic identity cards, which means that they have no right to access any kind of medical services. Or you go to a country where there's 50% Indigenous population, and yet there's not a single doctor in the country that speaks the Indigenous dialect. It's ludicrous. And I'd always understood there were the same issues in Australia, but I hadn't really been exposed to Indigenous health before I left for India. And in a strange way, working in India and working in human rights made me so much more passionate about coming back to Australia and working to secure the health rights of minority groups here in Australia, whether it be Indigenous people or women or children.
And as a doctor/lawyer, you're in a great position to do that.
Well, I hope so. I really hope that I can make a unique contribution in the coming years. I think that having a background in health law and human rights is an unusual combination. And
powerful starting point.
Well, yeah, and I think that it is still really important, even with all of these amazing experiences overseas, to get your basic qualifications. I've since come back and qualified as a doctor and as a lawyer in this jurisdiction. And that will hold me in good stead no matter what I do in the future, whether it's working in an international role or working in Australia.
Can I ask you before we finish, because I'm conscious that you're going to have to run off in a moment, but if you had sort of two pieces of advice for yourself 10 years ago, someone entering global health, potentially listening in from somewhere around the world, what would those two pieces of advice be, do you think?
Well, the first one would be that there is no defined path. And you have to be a person that's comfortable with that. Many doctors and many lawyers would just prefer, and this is no judgment on them, they would prefer to train in a defined specialty program, work in the same city where they trained, and there's that seductive familiarity about it.
Absolutely.
It really takes an enormous amount of courage to step outside those boundaries. And certainly when I deferred my internship, I really felt like I was stepping into the great unknown. But I haven't regretted it, like I said. And I think that given there is no defined path, you have to be very prepared to look for and take opportunities outside of, your normal sphere of influence, as it were. And I suppose the second piece of advice that I would give, which follows directly on from that, is that opportunities often occur in places where you'd least expect them to. So I'm not saying you have to intern at WHO to get a job in global health. In fact, I actually think that is one of the more difficult ways to do it. I'm one of the, 1 in a million who managed to get a job out of interning at WHO in Geneva. I think that you should spend time in developing countries. I think you should work with a civil society organisation that you're interested in, even if it means having to do some time pro bono or free of charge. I really think that opportunities can spring from the most amazing places. And, I did a lot of volunteer work for the Red Cross as a medical student. I did a lot of volunteer work for other organisations like student unions, and I am still amazed to this day at how those connections and those experiences have been, integral in me finding my career path, even though they weren't strictly directly related to what I was studying or the career I wanted to pursue. So, yeah, I think those would be my two pearls of wisdom.
You've talked about mentorship. You've talked about travel, you've talked about getting off the path and, having confidence in yourself, and you've summed up some great points. Thank you very much for spending 20 minutes with us. And
my pleasure, Sandro.
Look forward to speaking to you again in the future, Fiona.